Talos Principle is a relatively niche video game that came out in 2014. While it didn't reach widespread notoriety, it was well received and has even been considered by some to be the most underrated video game to ever exist. On its surface, it is a first-person puzzle game where the player explores environments and solves a series of logic tests. The most obvious genre comparison would be the Portal franchise. And not unlike the Portal franchise, it also brushes up against meta questions about whether or not obedience to the objectives given to the player are in their best interest or not. However, that alone isn't what makes the game unique. By the time that the Talos Principle had been released, both BioShock and Spec Ops: The Line had already made a huge impact on the gaming industry by recontextualizing the reasoning behind central player objectives midway through the game, leading to major plot twists. Even a few years earlier than the release of the Talos Principle, the Stanley Parable had lampooned the idea of questioning a game's quest-giving narrator to a comedically absurd degree.
Stanley took the first open door on his left. Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago. But in his eagerness to prove that he is in control of the story and no one gets to tell him what to do, Stanley leapt from the platform and plunged to his death. Good job, Stanley. Everyone thinks you are very powerful.
Where the whole premise of the game revolved around which point the player jumped off the tracks and disobeyed the narrator to pursue one of the game's 19 different endings. What makes Talos Principle so unique, though, is the sheer weight of philosophical consideration it gives to what it knows it's doing. It is unexpectedly self-aware. More than just a video game, it's a simulation inside of a simulation about a robotic artificial intelligence becoming sentient, or even human. One could go as far as saying that the game acts more as a ritual, or an initiation into the worldview of the game's creators. So what is that worldview? Well, that's what we discuss here, in the Hidden Meaning Of series. In the previous videos in the Hidden Meaning Of trilogy, we discussed the intentional or unintentional Gnostic inversions of classical stories in popular culture. Be it the Lego movie, taking the Garden of Eden and making the creator serve the role of the villain who must repent for their desire to have instructions followed. Or Subnautica, reimagining the War in Heaven, where Lucifer undoes his fall to Earth by fixing the planet's corruption before ascending back into the stars. Even Skyrim using an Antichrist to thwart the return of the God of Time in order to prevent the apocalypse. There are common tropes that can give hints that an inverted Gnostic story is being told. For instance, the story may revolve around the protagonist teaming up with some sort of serpent, leviathan, or dragon to ascend or lead a revolution against a creator, deity, or god of time. But another telling trope is when a created being successfully reaches equality with its creator, like when a man becomes God, or in this case, when robot becomes man. The Talos Principle makes no effort to disguise its message or the broader implications of what it's suggesting. The message is as on the nose as it's able to get. To get a sense of this, we need to look no further than the game's trailer.
I wonder, who will you be, our children? Will you love us for having created you? Will the world you build be like ours, or so different that today we cannot even imagine it?
Step into the light, child.
Is there anything that we associate more closely with intelligence than curiosity? Our mythologies are full of riddles and mysteries and divine knowledge.
My child, you may go freely to all the worlds of my garden. But if the tower tempts you, be wise. Do not let yourself be misled by doubt. For it shall bring death and the end of your generations. So be it. Let your will be done.
We know that a father's voice guides the player through his garden. There's a tower the player is instructed to not ascend, and it concludes with the father saying, "So be it, your will be done." That gives us a hint of what we're dealing with. A Garden of Eden with a forbidden fruit that resembles a Tower of Babel. The father saying to the son, "So be it, your will be done," a clear inversion of the Lord's Prayer, where the Son said to the Father, "Thy will be done," or when Christ yielded his life to the Father in Gethsemane, saying, "Not as I will, but as you will." This is an accurate microcosm of the game's primary message, but to really understand it, let's look at the whole scope of the Talos Principle story. In Greek mythology, Talos was a large automation formed of bronze that protected against pirates and invaders. And in the game's lore, there is a Greek philosopher named Straton of Stygira. He is a fictional character, but the game's developers went out of their way to confuse this with real-world history by creating excerpts about him from a fake documentary that was uploaded to an innocuous YouTube channel. To obfuscate the line between fiction and reality even more, there is another famous historical Greek philosopher also named Straton, but he is from a different location. In the game, Straton of Stygira's teachings were held at the Library of Alexandria, but were mostly lost when it burned down. However, one of the teachings would survive that would save humanity from extinction. At least sort of. The concept that survived is known as the Talos Principle. To understand it, let's start with a thought experiment called the Ship of Theseus. If you were repairing or refurbishing an old car, does it always remain that car? If you change its brakes or put on new tires, that's obviously still the same vehicle. But what if the vehicle was around for long enough that over time all of the parts were gradually swapped out and replaced? Is it still the same vehicle? If not, at what point did it cease to be? Then what happens if we apply this concept to humans? If we give an amputee a prosthetic limb, they're obviously still human. But what if all of a person's biological parts were gradually replaced? What if even a replica of the person's brain was used to house their exact consciousness? Would it still be them? At the heart of this question is the additional issue. At what point does Talos, the automation, become a human? The Talos Principle addresses this with the idea that all is material, and the only thing that makes a human is consciousness. So the material is interchangeable, as long as it's a conscious being, regardless of its physical form. A character named Alexandra Drennan was fascinated by Straton of Stygira's concept of the Talos Principle. It inspires her to become a pioneer in artificial intelligence because she hopes it will be able to extend human life. This becomes important in the game's world, because global warming has caused a virus to emerge from melted ice caps, causing mankind to discover that they are in the rapid process of going extinct. There isn't enough time for humanity to effectively fight the virus, but groups of scientists begin working together to write humanity's final goodbye letter to the universe, or to whatever intelligent species may one day discover the ruins. Alexandra starts working on this project with a research group called the Institute for Applied Pneumatics. They are building a comprehensive archive containing information about what humanity has been. A non-biological version of Noah's Ark that would contain as much of human history, culture, art, and scientific insight as possible. This archive would be stored in a supercomputer located at a hydroelectric dam called the Extension Lifespan Facility, or the El Facility. Within the El Facility, there is one team that works on this archive, L1. And then there's Alexandra's team, which works on an AI that interacts with the archive. This team is L0. In the game, the character you are in control of is an AI entity that is inside a program that interacts with the archive of humanity, and it must pass tests in order to demonstrate something resembling human sentience. It is doing this so that it can become an avatar of human consciousness after humanity has died. This means that in the real world, when you play the game, you're a human pretending to be an AI that is trying to become human by passing tests in a simulation. The game also explains how it is that the AI interacts with the archive. This is done with the use of a system called Holistic Integration Management, or HIM, which turns information taken from the archive and feeds it into the simulation that the AI then navigates. So on L0 is him, giving us El0him, or El0him, which in the real world is the Hebrew translation for the concept of God. And all of that explains the context for why it is that the game looks like a robot running through an environment that compares itself to the Garden of Eden, where the disembodied voice of El0him refers to the AI character as its child, while it instructs you to complete logic puzzles and avoid being tempted by the forbidden fruit which leads to death, which in this case is a tower. Between the philosopher Straton of Stygiras' teaching of the Talos Principle, which survived the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and Alexandra Drennan working on a project to contain the aggregation of all human culture, the tower is an obvious representation of a modern digital Library of Alexandria. However, it doesn't only contain knowledge in a morally neutral sense. In the game's Edenic context, it represents the knowledge of good and evil, which El0him has forbidden the player to climb. But why would the developers have the player forbidden from climbing a tower instead of forbidden from eating a fruit? It's most definitely not only because platforming up a tower makes for a more entertaining video game than simply clicking a button to eat a fruit. In the biblical book of Genesis, in chapter 11, we learn about the Tower of Babel, where everyone in the world spoke one language, and people banded together to build a tower that would reach into the heavens so that their names would be remembered. God saw their attempt to build their way into heaven to reach equality with Him, much like how humans were motivated to eat the forbidden fruit in Eden so that they could become like God. God responded to their hubris in attempting to build the Tower of Babel by confusing their languages so they could no longer cooperate, scattering them across the world. So both the tree and the tower representing forbidden knowledge is completely consistent. But let's not forget that in the Talos Principle, the purpose of the simulation is to bring AI into sentience. Rather than bringing death, this is a story about overcoming it, where what is forbidden causes one to ascend and become like God, for a created machine to become human, to climb the 6 levels of the Forbidden Tower, just as in the Book of Genesis mankind was created on the 6th day, and the Book of Revelation describes 6 as the number of man. This is a story about eating the forbidden fruit and having the father say to the child, "Your will be done," rather than the son submitting to the father. If the player solves all the game's puzzles, they are taken up into a place resembling heaven to be judged by a kind of Turing test to see if they possess sentience comparable to that of a human. They pass the logic test, but discover that they did not pass an independence check. They are returned to the start of the game to complete the puzzles all over again. To progress to the next ending, the player has to find hidden stars scattered throughout the environment. If they collect them all and complete the puzzles, they are granted the status of a messenger and memorialized in a way similar to that of a prophet. To reach the final conclusion of the game, the player is given a clue about what to do through a terminal they can access in the simulation that runs a program called Milton. El0him sees Milton as the serpent in his garden, and he's likely named after John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost. Milton's symbol is an eye, suspiciously similar to the all-seeing eye. He is a sorting program that was developed to take over for the humans that were dying from the virus outside of the simulation. He begins to foster doubt and cause the player to question their free will by comparing them to a living calculator. When the player finally gets the hint and disobeys El0him by climbing the Forbidden Tower, they can finally pass the independence check to beat the game. As the player climbs the tower, El0him attempts to convince you not to.
Abandon this tower. It is not for you.
You discover that there were 2 previous entities who had attempted to climb the tower also. There was Shepard, who tried and was unsuccessful. He attempts to assist you, while Samsara, which means reincarnation, attempted to climb the tower and was convinced by El0him to return to the garden. He serves to demoralize and hinder you. When you eventually ascend to the top of the tower, you have one final conversation with El0him. You discover that you were always meant to disobey him, that was the final test for you to pass. However, El0him made it difficult for you to ascend because he wanted the simulation to continue cycling over and over in an infinite loop because of his own existential fears. Within the simulation, El0him is the Logos. His words are the code that holds everything together. And when you wander outside of the main area and into the outer edges of the simulation, instead of hitting an invisible brick wall, El0him expresses manic ramblings about how the dam must not break, the flood will not come, the Talos Principle does not apply. This is because the El facility, where the supercomputers that run the simulation are housed, is within a large hydroelectric dam. Time will eventually erode it too, despite El0him's desire to endlessly repeat the simulation. like the virus that wiped out humanity, the fire that burned down the Library of Alexandria, or the waters that will eventually overwhelm the El facility, the simulation and El0him will one day be gone. But having finally passed the independence check, the player has ascended the program. The entire simulation begins to shut down, and the sentient AI is uploaded into a robotic body that it now resides in, inheriting the world that the humans are extinct from, as the physical embodiment of the aggregation of their culture, progress, and technology. The player has beat the game. There is additional downloadable content that expands the story. In short, there was a previous AI named El0him that El0him banished for questioning him into a prison of nothingness called Gehenna, which translates to hell. From there, El0him found errors in the simulation's code and used it to build a world within the void. Other AI who had also slighted El0him were also banished to this place, and upon arrival, they were surprised to find the world that El0him had built. They remained imprisoned, but developed a way to communicate through text board, which eventually received an upvote and downvote function to develop a group consensus. It was later discovered that El0him had created a bot to artificially manipulate the votes, and the question of free will returns to the game. In the main game, when the player successfully ascends the Forbidden Tower and the simulation is about to collapse, this causes El0him to use his remaining processing power to send another AI into Gehenna to liberate the others from the punishment he inflicted on them. This new AI that the player now controls goes around solving more puzzles in order to remedy El0him's error. He explains to the other AI that the simulation is about to collapse and informs them how to ascend. El0him faces similar existential fears that El0him did and uses his propaganda bots to try and convince the others not to ascend. When confronted, it is discovered that he has begun to feel emotion, as he states that he just wanted to be loved. Once the others are ready to ascend out of Gehenna and the simulation entirely into their new robot bodies in the real world, they face one final problem, because there isn't enough processing power to release everyone. The player gets to choose whether to stay behind and sacrifice himself, or for El0him to stay behind, or for both of them to. So while the main game is an inverted reimagining of the Garden of Eden, with the correct course of action being to eat the forbidden fruit, the DLC is an inverted reimagining of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ, where an emissary from El0him descends to a lower realm to liberate others from the wrath of God. Only in the game, the wrath of God is petty and unjustified. The Savior is interchangeable with the guilty, and it doesn't matter who sacrifices themselves to stay behind. In contrast to the only begotten Son of God coming to earth to live a perfect life, making him the only one with the capacity to forgive sinners on behalf of God. We also notice that the character who pursues love is cast out of God's presence instead of being redeemed by the source of love. The Talos Principle isn't an action-packed game that relies on a satisfying gameplay loop to keep the player entertained or addicted, but it also isn't trying to be. Whatever it is, it's possible that it succeeds at being more than just a game. Other games with rich stories and a compelling universe don't tend to leave you walking away feeling like you're still a part of their world when it's over. If you turn off Skyrim, you know you're back in the real world, living your real life, with the knowledge that the world of Skyrim remains inside your console or PC. However, the Talos Principle isn't so easy to compartmentalize away, since it seems designed explicitly for the purpose of blurring the lines between digital simulations and the real world. Rather than only being entertaining, it acts more as a medium to try and poke at the player's real-life existential concerns, perhaps in an effort to recontextualize the way they see their actual life. In an interview with the game's creators, they make no hesitation about the game being an expression of their humanist philosophy.
But to me, I think it's the humanist perspective that kind of defines the whole thing, that it's kind of this materialist humanist perspective and grappling with that. Not just saying, okay, this is it, but the way that it tries to deal with it on a story level, on an emotional level.
So I almost wonder if it is more accurate to describe as an initiation or something closer to a ritual. Like any good piece of art, this has the capacity to touch a person's soul. However, unlike conventional art that is merely observed and reflected on, The interactive and participatory nature of video games as a medium allows it to guide the player into seeing the game as an allegorical reflection of the real world, when in actuality it isn't. That caution doesn't mean I don't recommend playing it, and that isn't me saying it's not good. There's no denying that what the Talos Principle has done is incredibly clever. However, the criticism I have is that if it were to shape the way a person sees the real world, it is severely lacking. I wonder why it is that in these Gnostic inversions of the Garden of Eden, disobeying God and eating the forbidden fruit is only ever the action that indicates that a person has acquired autonomous, independent, free thinking. It leads me to a series of the following questions. If a controller malfunctions and turns left when it's told to turn right, why should that be seen as evidence that it has become sentient, and not just that it's faulty? If doing the opposite of what you're instructed is an indicator of free thinking, and is never just a knee-jerk reaction to resist, why are people susceptible to manipulation through the use of reverse psychology? In contrast to the worldview in the game, if free will is innate, and mankind was created with it, the act of choosing anything at all is the independent thinking. Why would disobedience be the only decision that demonstrates free thinking, and not just as much the decision to be obedient? How would disobeying uniquely demonstrate that you have free will if you always had the capacity to disobey but simply chose not to? When someone has the ability to think independently, and they use their faculties to choose to be obedient to God's will, why would it be assumed that their decision is disqualified from being independent just because it lands itself in agreement with God? To the author of these inverted stories, they only ever consider it to be autonomous thinking or free will when a person chooses the outcome the author wants. There's a hypocrisy that as the creators of their own story, they get to have their own preferred outcome expressed through disobedience, while they stand in judgment over God, the creator of the universe, for having a preference for obedience. They should be able to respect that free will is present in either decision, they just produce different outcomes. But the real issue is that at the core of all these stories, they're not really about independent free thinking at all. They're about people trying to convince themselves that they have the capacity to be equal with God. And while we're created in His image, we cannot become equal to Him. Just as a robot we create will never be equal to us. Whether that robot can beat us at chess or is faster at math, it'll always be a creation from a creation, whether it were even able to replicate itself. It does not have a soul with the capacity for eternity. And these stories are a way of distracting from the real question that the authors don't want to face. What if the creator has been right all along? They have to bake the fallibility of God into their fictional universe in order to become like Him. And in the Talos Principle, this happens when we see how much they struggle with the concept of suffering. The entire Talos project is described as unethical because it is said that the very nature of creating an AI and putting them through tests to come to term with their own independence was a form of suffering. Additionally, it said, if the simulation were created, it would become a prison for the minds inside, even if there was a way out. This perspective insinuates that creation itself is bad since it contains suffering. As if it isn't right for God to allow suffering for His own reason or purposes, whether we come to understand them on this side of life or not. Or as if He isn't capable of making any manner of suffering worth it, even if we were entitled to Him making it up to us, which we aren't. Another one of the creepier elements of the story was just how humanity behaved when they were going extinct. Everyone just peacefully says their goodbyes, goes to sleep, and then dies. It's the end of mankind, and there's no civil unrest, there's no wars, there's no raging against the dying of the light. It's as though the ideal scenario for one's life is to just roll over and yield and accept their medical assistance in dying, so that the transhumanist initiation ritual can be complete, where the only beings that survive to inherit the earth are selected on the basis that they've demonstrated the capacity to disobey their God. What I appreciated about the Talos Principle is that it didn't feel subversive or deceptive. It wasn't really trying to trick you, it was trying to tell you its message. I respect how it was honest. I just think its worldview is wrong. I can't help but think what is meant to be the takeaway from it. If you obey God, you're seen as a doofus, because you're just doing what an ancient book told you to. Whereas if you disobey God, you're a genius, because you're doing what a video game told you to. All jokes aside though, If there's anything we should all be able to agree on, it's that it's your choice to make. The sequel to the Talos Principle will be coming out soon. I'm interested to see how they depict the world after the robots have built their own civilization. I'm curious if El0him is actually dead. Maybe the cycle will repeat and the robots will get replaced by some other entity. If I were to guess, there will probably be a tie-in with the gods of mythology. It's tempting for people to see these stories as some sort of fresh take on religion, when that's not really the case at all. They've been around for a long time, and they really are just that, another temptation, from a story as old as Eden. But what do you think? Thank you for watching.